Well, I'd like to welcome everybody to another Fireside Adoptees Adoptee Fire series interview. And we have a really special guest here today, Kathleen, Shea, Kirstein. And she's a late discovery adoptee. She also discovered later through DNA testing that who she thought was her bio dad was actually not her bio dad, which means she's actually in what we call an NPE as well. And she'll be talking about that too. She's a retired nurse. She has 2 sons and she lives in New Hampshire. I'm fortunate enough to know her in person. She's somebody who's become very special to me as a friend and someone I have constant interactions and dialogue with. So we've developed a really nice friendship, and her story has been very compelling to me. And I just wanted to give her a chance to share about it here. She's been an illustrator for 3 children's books. She's had publications in Severance Magazine. She enjoys a lot of creative activities like writing, painting, and drawing. She makes wonderful cards. Maybe she can talk to us about that, give greeting cards. And she was also a registered nurse for a very long time. And until her career ended, her retirement, she was known as a very compassionate person in the space, in the hospital that she worked in, and the places that she attended, where people benefited greatly from her enormous heart and the great care that I could attest to, has displayed very wonderfully for a lot of people. And she's also somebody that I will say, and she's described herself also as a collector of names. So you may know her as WKJ, Wendy Kathleen Janet, and there's a reason behind all of the names. We're going to talk about that as well. But first, let me just welcome you, Kathy. I know you as Kathy, but a lot of people do know you as WKJ.
Thank you. It's nice to be here.
Really excited you're here. And I feel like this is one of these types of interviews that almost will run itself, partly because I'm just so comfortable with you as a person. I mean, we had lunch. You showed me around Keene, New Hampshire just last week. Look forward to seeing you at our monthly Adoptees Connect meetings. And you are also somebody, though, I think a lot of people can say that is very well loved in our community, and is someone that I think you're the nicest adoptee. I know a lot of nice adoptees, but you're a very kind-hearted person. And I was really excited that you said yes to this. It just seemed like a very natural progression for us to get more of your story out there. And I know you've told it a couple places, and I know it continues to unfold for you, just like it does for so many of us. But I don't want to take up all the time talking about me, but I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about what it means for you to be an LDA, how you discovered that, and that's a late.
I actually discovered the LDA when my husband won a free trip to Cancun, Mexico. And he'd had a passport that needed to be renewed. I'd never had a passport. Now, I had always had a photostatic copy of a birth certificate, so I knew I was born in Vermont. My mother told me once and only once my birth story. Her provider was up there. She was really nervous, and so that's where he said she could deliver, because Burlington, Vermont, he was a skier. So the passport envelope came from the passport office, and I was really super excited because this was like my ticket to travel the world. And I opened it up, and there was one passport inside my husband's, and mine was not there. And so I called the passport office and said, what do I do? And they said, well, your birth certificate was filed 14 months after your actual birth, and you never sent us any documentation to explain this. So immediately called my mother, who said, oh, it must be a clerical error. And then actually stopped talking to me. And we talked all the time. So that should have been a clue for me, but it wasn't. So I ended up calling the town clerk in Burlington, Vermont, who said, oh, I see your birth certificate's right here. It was signed by a judge, your parents' names, send money and I'll send it out to you. And a couple of weeks later, I got a call from her saying, I'm sorry, I can't send you your birth certificate and you need to contact probate court. So, and of course, in order to talk to all of these people, it has to happen during working business hours. So I would punch out early and take my lunch early so I could make these calls. Because if I called at my lunchtime, it would be their lunchtime. So I worked in a room with 5 other people. So 5 other people watched this all unfold. Probate court said, send money, send a letter. Now, the trip was scheduled for September 25th. And I did online research all night. I don't know why, but I thought I might find some kind of website that would miraculously say, oh yeah, you were, here's your story. And of course that's not realistic, but that's what was going through my head. Passport people said they would send me a birth affidavit and a census application that I couldn't use, and I couldn't use school records or church records or anything like that. They said I'd get this envelope in 2 weeks. The initial contact had been the beginning of June. It was now August 22nd. And so I'm only a month away from the trip. I started to wonder what it would be like to live in Cancun, because I could go, but I could never get back into the United States. And then I thought, well, maybe Cancun needs nurses. I wonder how long it would take to get a Mexican license. And we also and I think it's because my sense of humor is kind of whacked, that I suddenly came up with the idea, well, that maybe those 14 months I spent at a baby terrorist camp. Because I think I needed to think worst possible scenario, just because that's how I do things. I think worst case and then move from there. So my father agreed to sign the birth affidavit, came over, met with the notary. I introduced them to each other, and then I backed away and let them do their thing. So I don't know what he actually wrote on that form, but I do know that he initially said to me, well, I don't know what to say. And I said, well, just tell him, you were at my birth, and I don't know, describe something. Now I know that I was actually giving him the words to commit perjury. They did their thing. I thanked her. We were walking back to my office, got to the door for him to go out, gave him a big hug, said thank you, and he mentioned a doctor's name. And it was not the doctor that my mother had always told me. And I was kind of familiar of this doctor because working in the clinic hospital, the doctor my mother mentioned was very well known. So when he said that, I went back to my desk and thought, I've always gotten my care here in this building. And in fact, medical records was actually 2 floors under my desk chair. And I'd been in the building since 1984. And this was now 2005. So I said, I'm going to call for my chart. And of course, everybody in the room pipes up, oh, we'll call it for you. We'll call it for you. And there was something that made me say, no, I have to do this legally. So called my friend in medical records. She said, come down. I signed all the forms, got my chart, opened it to the very last page of the chart. Now, I need to say that I've had my chart in my hand one other time. I was supervisor of our Brattleboro, Vermont office for 2 years in family practice, and we gave each other flu shots. And so rather than having 2 immunization records, I brought the sticker with me and just updated the record in my chart. If only I had the presence of mind to look back. Anyway, open the back of my page, says adopted baby, 4 pounds, 4 ounces, 2 weeks premature. I make a copy of that page. I go back to my desk. I float the copy over the shoulder of one of my colleagues. She gasps incidentally, that colleague has since been a MyHeritage match as a very distant cousin. And we only found that out a year and a half ago. The first thing I thought of when I saw adopted baby, 4 pounds, 4 ounces, preemie, I'm like, oh my God, that's why I'm always early for everything. I was born early. Of course, it's my internal time clock. My brain still wasn't hearing the adoption piece. And so I called home, said, hey, guess what? I'm adopted. I immediately called probate court and said, I'm not supposed to know this, but you're looking for adoption records. And she said, okay, I'll tell the judge, send a letter, make sure you include the copy of that office note, and I'll call you back if you need to send more money. Went home, did that. And then the doctor I worked for, we needed to go over messages. So, went back to his office with my message book. We did the work. I got up. As I'm starting to leave, I turned to him and say, I really probably need to apologize, because if I'm a little off this afternoon, it's because I just found out I was adopted. He did not have a clue of what to say and just blankly looked at me. I went back to my desk and did the rest of the day. I clearly did not feel it or really process it. It was just words coming out of my mouth. I could say the words, but then I did, on the drive home, I'm thinking, okay, well, who are my parents? What's my medical history? Because I was 49 years old. So I had spent half my life with the wrong family medical history. And then the other thing that came to my mind is that I had a cousin who, senior year in high school, became diabetic. My grandmother lived with us, and she'd lived with us since I was 1, when my grandfather died. She was diabetic. So nobody could figure out why I wasn't the diabetic, because I was not skinny by any means. Everybody else in the family was pretty thin. So I knew from probably age 12 that I was different. My body style was different. My problem-solving skills were different. In fact, I'd asked every adult member of my family if I'd been adopted, and they all said no, and that I was absolutely crazy to think that thought. So I convinced myself I was crazy and that it was only my problem and I was wrong. So for it to sort of hit on the way home that, oh my God, now I know why it was not me that got the diagnosis that can sometimes run in families. So I still did the internet searching. It never occurred to me to think about a maternity home. And it never occurred to me to wander over to the OB department of where I worked, because there's really only one maternity home that they were using, and that was the Lund Center in Burlington, Vermont, where I was born. And then the next day when I went back to work, I talked to our psychologist at work, because he'd seen my dad, who had clinical depression. And at this point now, I'm thinking, do I tell them I know? What kind of defenses have they built up? How am I going to handle this? I was pretty sure I couldn't perpetuate a lie. So he loved to problem solve, and he agreed to meet me 2 days later, which was a Wednesday. And he and I actually had worked on the behavioral health improvement team, so we knew each other. The morning we were supposed to have lunch, I got a call from my father saying, you need to come over. And I said, okay, I'll come over after work. And he said, no, you can't. You have to come right now. Never supervisor anywhere when you need one. Luckily, I had a bit of seniority where I could just turn to my colleague and say, let Nancy know I have a family emergency. Now, for me, I call these God moments, and I don't, everybody can call them whatever they want. But I was doing phone triage at the time, and phone triage in family practice is pretty specific, and only certain people can man the phone. So there happened to be an RN sitting in our flow room who didn't have an assignment yet. So I put her on my phone, and something told me that they were going to tell me, because I stopped off at the hospital gift shop and I got my mother a long stem red rose. Now, I grew up in the neighborhood where the hospital is, so it's like a 5-minute walk, but I did choose to drive. Got to the house, walked up the stairs, walked into the living room. My father said, "You know why you're here?" And I said, "Yes, I've known since Monday." And now in retrospect, I know that's where I made my mistake. I should have said no and made them tell me. But essentially what I did was I took them off the hook because they never had to actually say the words. Oddly enough, my mother was sitting in the corner with her card table with a puzzle in front of her. So she'd not been talking to me since June. And then now she had this barrier of a puzzle table between us. She was in her nightgown and her robe. And she just looked at me and said, "My life is over. I'm supposed to go to lunch with the girls, and I just can't. My life is over." And at that moment, I made the decision. And part of the decision I think I made subconsciously and part consciously, that from that moment on, they would never experience an ounce of rejection, and that I would prove to them through my behavior that they could have told me sooner. So essentially what I did was I put any kind of healing or any kind of anything for me personally on a shelf. And that's where it sat until I'm 66 now. So they had the name of the adoption coordinator. So they wanted me to call her. But they did tell me that the day they got the call, they didn't know that they were going to bring me home. I guess they thought they were going to go shopping. I don't know. So they weren't prepared in the least bit. And so they had to do a little shopping trip up in Vermont. Now, Burlington, Vermont is a 3-hour drive today for me on really good interstate highways. So in 1957, in March, it was an all-day trip. So they brought me home a laundry basket. They didn't want to know anything about my birth mother. They had 3 bottles with the name Wendy. So, I said to Mom, "Yes, of course, your life isn't over. Isn't it really good that I get to know the story of the laundry basket?" And then because my mother worked at the clinic as the secretary, she had to train her replacement. So my dad got to take care of me for the first couple of days. And my godmother was a registered nurse. And I guess they told me a story of Dad changing diapers when he should have been a little more patient. So that was a funny story to hear. But the other thing that I heard was that my mother, when she filed that office note that day of my first checkup, went into the doctor and said, you need to remove this adopted baby from her chart. And he refused. And that to me is the second God moment. And then the third God moment is just that my parents couldn't remember where they got me. There was another family in town who had adopted at the same time from the same place. And I can't imagine the call. Hey, where'd you get your kid? Luckily, you know, they were still alive and they knew. So yeah, that's pretty much how I found out.
And I wanted you to tell that because it's so impactful to me each time I hear it. And the same things stand out as they did the first time, plus some new things, but the way you absorbed everybody else's discomfort. Said it's going to be on me. They're never going to have to deal with this. How do you feel about having done that now? What is that like to you now?
I don't have any regrets for doing that. I am glad that that's what I did. I will say, though, that I now know that I did a huge disservice to myself. Because now at 66, I'm starting to do the healing work that I should have done at age 50.
It's interesting how you said that you put off the healing by doing what you did there, absorbing. You know, I think it's not uncommon for a lot of us to have taken on the emotional burden of our adoptive parents. And many of us were much younger when that started, of course, but you had, as you said, half of your life elapsed at that point. And I wonder if you really felt like it was just a very conscious decision. I'm not going to do this. Were you just aware of going, nope, I'm not doing that?
Yeah, no, it was conscious. And unfortunately, maybe it's my trauma response that I put everyone else first. I always have. I continue to do that, even though I'm aware I'm doing it. I can't seem yet to change that behavior.
And the other thing is what we've talked about, which is the cool as a cucumber. You found out, you went right back to work. And we talked about Jack Rocco, friend Jack Rocco, who did the same thing as a surgeon. Found out something. He didn't find out about being adopted, but he found out about biological family and went right back to work. And we speculated on that, you and I, about what do you think is at the root of that for somebody maybe in the medical field?
I think part of it is the training.
Yeah.
I think part of it is the training, and I think the other piece is that we see so much, and sometimes we're in the position where we have to deliver really bad news to people. That there's always, at least in the back of my mind, there's always there's somebody else going through something that's much worse than this.
And yet this is like the explosion of your identity at age 49, right? You're like, I'm just going to go on in fragments, I guess, right? Like you said, the healing couldn't happen at that point. It had to be put off.
Yeah.
How do you collect the parts of yourself to go on during that time?
I don't think I did. I didn't. I minimized. I minimized it. That was my survival skill. And I think also adapting. You know, now I say I've been adapting since I was born, and I feel that to be true. And I think I just take that adapting to the next level with everything.
Yeah. Adapting. I do hear other adoptees use that word in place of adopted. They talk about adapting. And we have the whole chameleon idea, right? People fitting in wherever they're dropped, so to say, or wherever they find themselves in that context, and having the way to. Now, I don't like the word resilient because I feel like it makes people go, "Oh, I just pulled myself up and I was fine." But there is a resilience we have to go on, even though it's not preferable that it was there because something awful happened for it to even be there in the first place. But the inner resourcefulness that you had that helped you get through this for a number of years. This wasn't the only big big thing that happened in your life, though.
No,
Can you talk
no.
about the next big thing?
Yeah, well, before the before the NPE happened, actually 2014, I got divorced. My husband left me for a younger man. It was totally out of the blue, and actually I was just about to be wheeled into surgery when I realized that he didn't love me anymore. And then the next month, oddly enough, just before I went into work one morning, I knew I was going to be divorced. 2019. Prior to that, in 2015, so I reunioned in 2006, and I learned that Biomom had dementia. She did always remember me, although other family will tell you that she totally denied my existence in order to survive her existence. She named me Wendy because she was told to use a name that she would never use for another child or a pet. I went to Vermont twice a year to visit. We had phone calls up until the point where she really couldn't do phone calls. And it was kind of interesting because at one point my husband said, "Well, why are you talking to her? Why are you talking to her on the phone? She doesn't understand anything." And I'm like, I don't care that she doesn't understand a word I'm saying. She's on the other end and she's listening, and periodically she'll say stuff back to me. And in fact, I told her that I had gotten the care manager job within our clinic. Dartmouth Medical Center was doing a research project, and I was being contracted out to Dartmouth to be the care manager for this. And it was a study on depression. And she looked at, and her response to me was, "Oh, you'll feel better soon. It's okay. It'll be all right." And that's just one of the Helen stories. I always, Helen was her name, and I always carried Helen stories. But so she told me my brother and I had the same father. 2015, I actually went to Italy, spent 2 weeks in Italy, 3 days in the home where my grandfather was born, did the DNA test for fun because I was obsessed with how much Italian I had. I grew up Irish, and French Canadian. DNA test came back. I was French, British, Scottish, Welsh, little Finland. So, and DNA matches that I did not have a clue. I mean, yes, a maternal cousin who I knew was there, but so I knew at that point that there was a problem. In my infinite wisdom of minimizing, my brother and I talked about, well, maybe Peter was an NPE. So he agreed to test. So December 31st at 6:30 p.m., In 2019, my brother's DNA came back, and he's French and Italian, and he's got really good DNA. And I was so jealous of his DNA. And then I totally dissolved into a pile of sobbing mess and cried myself into 220 because bio dad, while he was long dead, we had a lot of synchronicities. And in fact, the day he died, I discovered I was pregnant. I named my son Christopher, unaware that my half sister was Christina. And then there were some other synchronicities. So the fact that Peter was not my father was totally devastating. Maybe even a little more than the LDA, but not much. And so, the next, well, when I went back to work on the 2nd, I went back into my medical record and with tears erased the paternal half of my health history. And, to this day, I haven't put it back. Well, I can't now because I don't work there, but I could, have my provider put it back in, but I've not done that. But kind of well, I don't know if it's a funny story, but as a late discovery adoptee, I was able to join online support groups for NPEs because technically I got grandfathered in. And so because of my warped humor, I got on the thread for the high risk hope and healing and said, well, guys, guess what? Now I am officially part of this group because I am now an NPE too. And so a couple of them helped me work my family tree and eventually found a great aunt through my heritage who actually put a baby up for adoption from the same maternity home that I was born at, maybe a year before me, or maybe the same year. That I'm not 100% sure of, and I would really love to connect with that person if they were around. Reached out to a potential half brother who totally ghosted me. Spent a year trying to decide whether I was going to reach out to somebody or not. I have to back up here for a second to say that probably in 2008, I reached out to Peter's daughter, Christina. We met, had a great meeting, and then 3 days later, I got the email saying, never contact me again, don't contact any of my family. So I felt like I was a well-rounded adoptee because I had experienced the positive from the maternal side and the negative from the paternal side. So I knew both sides. So because of what happened with Christina, I was hesitant to, especially now that I knew she wasn't actually related to me, she was only related to my brother. I was hesitant to blow up somebody else's life. So it did take me a good year before I said, okay, I have one more opportunity. I have a half sister. If she denies my Facebook friend request and doesn't get back to me, then I'm going to say I'm done and I'm going to go to my grave not knowing who my father is, and I will grieve that loss. And she denied the friend request. So sent the group a message saying, okay, guys, I'm done. This is it. It's over. I'm sitting at my desk at work and my phone bings and it's the potential half sister. I looked at my office mate and I'm like, oh my God, what do? And her message to me was, how can I help you? Are you related on my side or my husband's side? And so I sent a little blurb to say sort of who I was. And she agreed to test. And I said, okay, send me your address. I'll send you the kit. I'm in the grocery store, standing by the case of chicken. I'm going to remember this moment for the rest of my life. She sent me a message saying she got the test kit. She's going to do it, get it to the postman. And I had a panic attack. And I said, oh my God, what if she's an MPE? What if she's going to have these DNA results that's going to be wrong? All of her people are dead. Nobody's going to be able to answer any questions for her. Can I live with this if this happens to her? So I've asked this person to take a test, and now I'm sending her a message saying, please be sure that you really want to take this test, because, sometimes, as we know, there are more questions that come from taking tests. And I mean, I was totally an idiot. Totally. I will own my idiotness. And she just sent me a thumbs up. And I'm like, okay, all right. And I told one other person in my group that I knew was just going to roll her eyes at me and say, oh my God, you fool. So she agreed to test. And April 1st of 21, the test came back. Let me just look at me. Yeah, in 21. And she sent me a message. It was early in the morning, and she said, your test came back, and I'm your cousin, and your father is Elmer. And I went into, and I chose Ancestry because I knew she had more people on Ancestry that matched than she did on 23andMe. And, I wanted her to have a good experience. So I went in, and I had previously sent her a chart about the centimorgans, because while 23andMe is easier because you get the actual how you're related, Ancestry comes in close family to first cousin. So I sent her the centimorgans so she'd have an idea. Went into my Ancestry, saw that she and I actually matched higher than my maternal brother. So at this point, I knew we were sisters. Now, how do I broach that with a person that I've only talked to and I don't really know? Do you sit there and say, well, no, lady, I'm sorry, you're wrong. I'm your sister, not your cousin. So I did spend some time thinking about, could I just always be your cousin? Would that be enough for me? And in May, she invited me to her cottage, her camper up in Vermont. And she looks like me. I look like her. Her body type is my body type. That was the first thing that struck me. She's 10 years older, exactly 10 years older. And as I was at the campground and people would come in on a Friday, and they've been camping at this place for years, so they know everybody knows them. One of her friends came through. She introduced me as, this is my cousin Kathy. And the friend looked at me and said, you look like you could be sisters. And I heard myself say, we are. And the friend didn't say anything. And then one other friend came through and said the same thing. And I again said the same thing. This time, I think that friend registered it, but my sister never registered it. And then surprisingly, she'd invited her brother, who had never been to the camping site, even though she's been there for like 10 years. Because I guess he was curious to meet his cousin. And we were sitting there, and I'm trying to hold it together because at age 62, 63, I'm in a room for the first time in my life with people who look like me. So I'm trying not to be emotional over it. George and his wife, Lynn, they're talking about all these places on the East Coast that they visited, all the same places I visited. They have some friends in Keene. I don't particularly know this people, but I know where their house is, just by their description. And first George made a comment about, well, I don't think I have any kids out there. And then the second comment he made was, knowing Dad, I'm surprised you're not a sister. And at that point, I said, well, I am, and I have the DNA to prove it, except the Wi-Fi was so bad that in that instance, I didn't have the DNA to prove it. Luckily, Messenger worked, and my friend Erin was online, and she was the one who helped me with my tree. So she had a copy of my DNA, so she could quickly get that to me so that I could prove it. But then he looked over at his sister and he said, wait a minute, I'm here under false pretenses. And he's starting to get all upset. And I'm like, well, wait a minute. And so I explained the Center Morgans and how it's a little more difficult. But yeah, at that moment I became a sister and I was no longer a cousin.
So we've talked about the layer of identity that's lost as an LDA. And then you have a further removal of NPE, not parent expected. So who you thought was your father turns out not to be your father. And you had probably a pretty shaky foundation before you got to the NPE part to begin with. So you basically on fumes for yourself as a person,
Yeah.
As an integrated person. I don't know,
Yeah.
am I ever speaking for you?
Yep. Nope, you're right.
Wow. And you have the demeanor, the calmness, but there was something else you told me about, which is coming out of the fog.
Yes.
So
yeah.
what is it for you?
Coming out of the fog for me was horrendous. It was like walking my favorite hiking path, getting lost in, I love trees. Getting lost and looking at the trees, walking along this path and just suddenly nothing underneath me. I literally would, so this happened December 3rd of 22. No, yes,
Yeah.
yes, because it was a year, December 3rd.
Yeah.
Now I am not an angry person. I think I've been angry a few times, and I'm one of those people that it's kind of like a little teeny tiny volcano where I erupt, people turn their heads and say, oh my God, I didn't know she had it in her. And then in about 2 seconds, it's gone. So I was not at all prepared for the fact that I woke up every morning with such intense anger and rage that I knew if I was around people, this was the kind of anger that could destroy a relationship in a nanosecond. But I also knew that I could also self-harm at the drop of a hat. So I would literally, for about a month, I would spend 2.5 hours in bed, just sitting with the anger, because I knew that's what was safe and that's what I needed to do for me in those moments. It would slowly get better as I sort of worked my way through it. Part of the problem for me was that there was all this anger. I couldn't assign it to anybody. I couldn't say, yes, you're the reason I'm so mad. I couldn't assign it to my parents because they were doing what they were told by the experts in 1957. It's not their fault that in 2023, all of those experts were wrong. So I can't blame them for that. I can't blame myself, although I will tell you, those first few mornings I did. I blamed myself for being born, which I would then say, well, that's stupid. You had nothing to do with that. What finally helped me the most is that I kept thinking, okay, this is anger, this is rage, this is anger, this is rage. And then I realized, ooh, this is Mr. Ranger. And I personalized it. And I created a little man cave in a very teeny tiny corner of my brain where Mr. Ranger can just kind of hang out. And I know my views are maybe a little skewed from mainline adoption community. And I don't necessarily need to go into any of that, except to say that one of the things, and it's the word human trafficking triggers me. And now that's the only point where, and I might have a little knock on the door from Mr. Ranger, like, okay, we gonna be okay here? Am I gonna, come to the surface? And I can say the word now, where a couple of months ago I couldn't. So, I've made vast improvements, and I can actually, yes, I can say that I was sold. Which I couldn't have done before. So I'm making the progress, but I will always go back to each individual case of adoption is individual to its circumstances and its situation and its people and all of that. And for me personally, that's where I'm probably always going to be. But anyway, yeah, it was horrendous.
You have grown a lot from it. And I know it was hard because I got to see when it happened within days. I remember you're like,
yeah,
happened. And I'm glad you had people that talked to you at the time that could talk with you about coming out of the fog. Of course, that's very individualized as well.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. It's going to be different for everybody.
So I feel like a couple of the final things I'd like to talk about. One of them is about names, collection of names, because you've described yourself that way.
Yeah.
You have a lot of names. Would you like to talk a little bit about that?
Sure. Initially, before I knew the reason why she picked this particular name, when I heard that I'd been born with an original name, in my head, I'm like, okay, how am I going to honor this name? Wendy Kathy did not sound right to me, but Wendy Kathleen did. But I also knew that at my age, I'm not changing anybody's. They know me as Kathy. They're going to call me Kathy. It's going to be really hard to change that. So in my head, I became Wendy Kathleen and started signing everything Kathleen, and new people would be introduced to me, and I'd introduce myself as Kathleen. And then I had a Facebook hack, and I had to have a new name. And I thought about the neurologist that I worked with for 6 years. We had a receptionist named Jana. Our body styles were a little similar. He always called me Janet. I corrected him a few times, didn't work. So to him, I was Janet. And that to me is a much better story. It's a much funnier story than the Wendy story. So as I've evolved, I've realized, yeah, the Wendy, not so much. So I've gone more with the Kathy, but I love the Wendy, Kathleen, Janet together. It's just so much fun. So because the Janet story is fun. So when I came back to Facebook, I came back as Wendy Kathleen Janet. Now, there are a few people who don't know me very well. So they're apt to call me Wendy. And I am learning that I have a voice, and I am learning that it's okay to use the voice. And I'm still really tentative baby infant steps with that. But I have realized that where I will absolutely use my voice is if somebody were to call me just Kathy. I mean, just Wendy. Then I would correct them and say, no, you need to tack the Kathleen onto that. And at one point, because of all these different names, I was at a retreat and somebody said, well, we should just give you another name each retreat. And so she said, yeah, your name can be Ralph. And I said, well, you say that, and that's funny, but my father was actually named after a Ralph Vincent, and my adopted dad, and his name was Vincent. So there was even a connection with the Ralph name. So yeah, that's how I'm collecting the names, and I am ashamed isn't the right word, but I will admit that there have been a few occasions where somebody has asked me my name and I've had to stop and figure it out. I don't know, what is my name? So in my real life, I use Kathy, and in community with adoptees, MPEs, I tend to gravitate towards the WKJ. But the other piece of this is that because we've been Zooms since COVID, there were a lot of times where I was in a room with 5 other Kathys, Kates. And so having the Wendy Kathleen or the WKJ really makes it a whole lot easier because there's less confusion, because I have not yet encountered a WKJ on a Zoom.
I'm sure there's going to be one next time. I'll just ask you this real quick. Do you feel like the multiplicity of names has anything to do with impermanence as that you might feel as an adoptee? Like, it doesn't matter as much. I'm just wondering, are you tied in any particular way to the name?
Yeah. It does a little bit, because I mean, one of the things I really worried about at first was that I didn't want to split myself in two, because there was Wendy and there was Kathleen, and I could see where I could get into trouble really fast with being 2 people, and I didn't want to do that.
Very interesting. And speaking of, so we have WKJ. Let's conclude by talking about RN.
Okay.
So RN, registered nurse.
Yes.
And recent revelations you've had about that.
I retired February 22nd of 22. We set our alarms and I punched out at exactly 2:22 p.m. because, you know, you got to have some fun. What I hadn't completely realized, I knew when I walked out of the building that day that I was not going to renew my license. Medicine has changed too much. I don't like how it's changed. My brain has gotten old. I mean, let's face it. I'm 66. I'm going to be 67 in about 60 days. I don't have the teenage young person brain that you need to have to keep all the balls up in the air. But I was not prepared for the emotional hit that the renewal notice would take. I saw that renewal notice and I thought, oh my God, am I going to think of myself as a lesser person because I no longer have these initials? Because what I realized is that I attached my self-worth and my value to the RN. The RN and the building that I worked in gave me the belonging that I never ever had. I don't even feel like I belong in my own house, which is very sad to say, but it's something that I will always face. And so it's just, well, it was, I mean, it's boards aren't fun. So, you know, I never want to take the boards again. So yeah, there was so much wrapped up that I wasn't aware of in these two little initials that, you know, I actually sat down and wrote a 6-page piece about it. And that really helped me see that, yes, I can figure out who I am without the actual initials after my name. I can stand alone. I can continually remind myself until I understand it that yes, um, I'm worthy, and yes, I'm brave, and yes, I can do this without the RN initials, but I'm going to be a work in progress, and come my birthday, February 5th, I am probably going to shed more tears, just because it's a letting go. And at this stage in my life, there's a lot more letting go than there is gaining. Not that you can't have wonderful things. Yes, I mean, there is life into your 80s and your 90s, in your hundreds. But yeah.
Well, I'm really honored to have been able to share this time with you. And I'm proud of you because I know that this is hard to do. It's not easy for people to tell their stories. Some can do it really easily. I know you've spent a lot of time thinking about your story and wanting to be very meticulous about the placement of things. You know, like I see you, what year was that? Let's flip back to the notes. Hope I didn't stress you out too much with the
No,
preparation.
and I will admit that I have been known to tell my story in line at the grocery for people. All they have to do is ask the right question and blah.
And you have, as I've just been telling people here, and as other people who know you know, just a very gentle, wonderful, sweet spirit. And I hope you know that. I hope you feel valued in our community as WKJ. A lot of people do know you that.
Yeah, I'm very lucky to have found such a wonderful group of people who support each other.
And I will say for all the people who'll be watching this through YouTube, that was an overwhelming response to the announcement of your interview and people asking, can I watch? I'm not an adoptee, can I watch? I said, unfortunately, you can't watch, but be really honored, excited if you would watch Kathy on our YouTube channel when it's out. So it's just a testament to how you're viewed all the way around, even, like I said, even outside of the community, just to see the way people have received you and the way they talk about you is universally just beloved. So I know I keep showering you with this, but that's always been my experience of you. And I've been happy to know you now about 14 months. Been such a valued part of the group we have here in New Hampshire when we meet in person. So I hope you'll continue to write, to make your cards, to do all the things, all the exploring and unpacking. And what an honor it's been to talk with you today.
Thanks. I've really enjoyed our conversation.
Thank you so much, Kathy. And for everybody, appreciate your being here to hear Kathy's story. And there's more of it too. But everybody has a lot to their story. But thanks so much to everyone. And again, please watch on Fireside Adoptees YouTube channel. You're going to hear the stop of the recording in a minute here, and then we'll go into Q&A. So thanks, everyone.